You may have heard that the world's most developed countries are also its biggest polluters. But do you know exactly what that means? How much more pollution is produced by a wealthy country compared to a poor one? And does the world have enough resources to support the lifestyles of both rich and poor countries? These are important questions for anyone who wants to understand how our planet works. So let's take a deep dive into the ecological footprint of rich versus poor countries. It's me, and this is Crash Course Geography. Last episode we talked about how geographers use the term development to describe the process of economic growth, political participation, and improved living standards. There are different ways of measuring development, but usually it comes down to how much money a country makes. One measure of a country's wealth is its gross domestic product, or GDP, which is the total monetary value of everything a country produces and sells on the market. A high GDP per capita means that on average people in that country have a lot of money. The higher a country's GDP per capita, the more developed it is considered to be. When we look at a map of GDP per capita, we see that the world's richest countries are all in North America, Europe, and Asia. The United States has the highest GDP per capita in the world. On average, each person in the US makes about $69,000 a year. Other wealthy countries include some island nations like Singapore and the United Arab Emirates. And while these countries aren't necessarily huge players on the world stage in terms of overall economy, they have very small populations, and so their GDP per capita is super high. Likewise, GDP per capita can tell us something about how much stuff an individual might own. Like on average, citizens of wealthy countries have more cars than citizens of less wealthy countries. In the US, for example, there are around 864 cars for every 1,000 people. Meanwhile, in Uganda, there are only 103 cars for every 1,000 people. But just because something is true on average doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions. Some individuals in low-income countries have a lot of stuff, and some individuals in high-income countries have very little. And while averages can tell us something about what life is like in a country, they don't tell us anything about how those resources are used. That's where ecological footprint comes in. Ecological footprint is a measure of human impact on the environment. It considers the amount of land and water needed to produce the resources a person or a country uses, and the amount of waste that is generated by that person or country. Basically, ecological footprint answers the question, how much of the Earth's surface is required to support the activities of a person or a country? If you were to plot the ecological footprint of every country in the world next to its GDP, you would see a really interesting pattern emerge. As a country becomes wealthier, its ecological footprint increases dramatically. This relationship between wealth and environmental impact is sometimes called the environmental Kuznets curve. Now, the shape of the curve varies across regions, but in general, as countries get richer, they use more resources and generate more waste. Take Japan, for example. Japan is an island nation with a very large population. Because of this, it has a very large ecological footprint despite being a relatively poor country. However, if we compare Japan's ecological footprint to other similarly situated countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, we see that they have even larger footprints. That's because although they're poorer than Japan, they use more energy and resources per person. To understand why, we need to look at how geographers measure ecological footprint. There are 5 main categories of human activity that contribute to ecological footprint. The resources used for food. For example, the land used for farming and the water used for irrigation. The resources used for housing and other infrastructure like roads and buildings. The resources used for goods and services, things like electronics and haircuts. Carbon sequestration, which is the way forests and oceans absorb and store carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And finally, the waste we generate. All of these things take up space. They either have to be built on or they have to be stored somewhere. For example, the state of Florida receives over 200 million visitors every year. All those tourists stay somewhere and all those places need to be cleaned. So we have to account for the garbage those visitors generate as well as the land that's used to store all that garbage. So when we look at the ecological footprint of a single country, it's a measure of all the land and water area required to support that country's economic activity. But we also need to consider the total biologically productive area of the Earth. We can do this by calculating something called biocapacity, which is basically the Earth's ability to generate resources and absorb waste. Biocapacity measures how much of the planet's surface is suitable for producing resources and for absorbing waste. Biocapacity is affected by a lot of things, including climate and how densely populated an area is. Generally speaking though, areas that receive a lot of sunlight and have a lot of water available are able to produce more resources, which means if more people live in those areas, those people will have a larger ecological footprint. We can see this in a country like Bangladesh. Bangladesh is very densely populated. Over 160 million people live in an area roughly the size of the US state of New York. All those people need food and water. So large areas of Bangladesh's limited arable land and freshwater resources are devoted to agriculture. This means Bangladesh's biocapacity is pretty low and its ecological footprint per person is relatively high. If we compare Bangladesh to another country with similar climate and geography like Indonesia, we see the same pattern emerge. Indonesia's biocapacity is lower than average, and its ecological footprint is higher than average. So the relationship between biocapacity and ecological footprint tells us something about how well a country is using its land. Countries with lots of resources and low populations have a high biocapacity relative to their ecological footprint. Places like Canada, Australia, and Brazil have more space and fewer people relative to their economic output, so their ecological footprint is lower than their biocapacity. Meanwhile, countries with limited resources and large populations like Bangladesh, Japan, and Egypt have a lower biocapacity relative to their ecological footprint, so their ecological footprint is larger than their biocapacity. Now we can go back to our original question about the difference between the ecological footprint of rich and poor countries. Well, if a country is wealthy but has a small population like Singapore, it tends to have a smaller ecological footprint than richer countries with larger populations like the US. That's because, in a country like the US, more land needs to be dedicated to growing food and other resources for a larger population, not to mention the additional resources required to build houses, offices, and other infrastructure to support all those people. So generally speaking, the larger a country's population, the larger its ecological footprint. But having a large population isn't the only reason some countries have a bigger ecological footprint than others. It's also because of the kind of economic activity those countries are engaged in. Countries that produce a lot of goods tend to have larger ecological footprints because making things takes a lot of energy and generates a lot of waste. An iPhone, for example, is made from rare metals and minerals that have to be mined and shipped all over the world. Manufacturing the phone requires complex machines that burn fossil fuels and create toxic waste. Then packaging and transporting the finished product to stores around the world takes even more energy. All of these activities require large amounts of land and water. Likewise, countries that are heavily involved in international trade tend to have larger ecological footprints because shipping things around the world takes a lot of energy. For example, 2/3 of the world's containerized cargo is carried on ships, and nearly half of all traded goods are carried by cargo aircraft. In addition to producing and moving goods, transportation infrastructure like roads, airports, and ports require a lot of land, energy, and resources to build and maintain. Finally, countries that rely on intensive forms of agriculture, especially industrial agriculture, tend to have larger ecological footprints. Industrial agriculture requires large areas of land for crops and livestock. It uses a lot of fossil fuels for tractors and other heavy machinery, and it relies on chemical fertilizers and pesticides that are made from petroleum products. Intensive forms of agriculture also require significant amounts of water for irrigation, which means that countries like Egypt and Bangladesh with large populations and limited water resources often have larger ecological footprints than wealthier countries with access to abundant water resources like the US and Australia. So now we're in a position to answer our original question. Rich countries tend to have larger ecological footprints than poor countries because wealthier countries use more energy and resources per person. They're engaged in more economic activity. The countries are larger and their agricultural systems are more intensive. These factors combine to make rich countries collectively responsible for the majority of global pollution. For example, the top 3 countries with the largest ecological footprints are the United States, China, and India. Together, these countries account for nearly half of the world's total ecological footprint. When we look at the data another way, we find that the world's richest 20% of people are responsible for about 80% of the world's ecological footprint, and the world's richest 10% is responsible for almost half of all carbon emissions. However, while the world's richest countries are the world's biggest polluters, they're not totally responsible. For example, the US has a very large ecological footprint, but most of that footprint falls outside its borders. A lot of the goods consumed in the US are made in other countries, especially Mexico and China. This means the US's consumption footprint is actually larger than its production footprint, which is the sum total of all the resources used and waste generated in the United States. The same is true for most rich countries. Their consumption footprint is larger than their production footprint because they consume more resources than they themselves produce. So the ecological footprint of rich countries depends on the ecological footprints of the poorer countries they rely on to produce their goods. In many ways, then, the world's rich and poor countries are linked together through a complex web of trade, finance, and investment. Understanding these connections helps us understand why some countries are rich and others are poor, and why the world's richest countries are also its biggest polluters. Many maps and borders represent modern geopolitical divisions that have often been decided without the consultation, permission, or recognition of the land's original inhabitants. Many geographical place names also don't reflect the indigenous or aboriginal people's languages, so we, at Crash Course, want to acknowledge these people's traditional and ongoing relationship with that land, and all the physical and human geographical elements of it. We encourage you to learn about the history of the place you call home through resources like Native Land, CA, and by engaging with your local indigenous and aboriginal nations through the websites and resources they provide. Thanks for watching this episode, which was filmed at a studio and was made in partnership with a digital studio and nature. You want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever? You can join our community on a crowdfunding platform.